represents, and Dave and I may disagree on some details here, but fundamentally SOAP emerged out of lowering the cost of integration, right? Of having a smaller set of abstractions that are fixed and not having wanton abstraction factories all over the place, but having a relatively small set of primitives and building using those. And actually, XMLRPC is a very similar model. XMLRPC, I love XMLRPC even though I will never use it, right? I am just genetically predisposed to not use XMLRPC, right? But I have infinite respect for XMLRPC because someone who built an app, someone who is building software said, I am going to limit the number of abstractions to a very finite set of primitives and type constructors. And you can combine these things in any way, shape, or form you want, but that's all you can do. And if you do anything other than these small fixed set of primitive types and type constructors, F you, you're not XMLRPC anymore. Is that right, Dave? And people beat Dave up about it, and I've certainly taken issue with some of the decisions in XMLRPC, even though I'm only nominally responsible for a couple of them, right? But the premise is right. The fact that you have a fixed set of abstractions that you get everyone to align upon, that's the high-order bit. Yes, Dave? Yeah, it's the Richard Gabriel thing, right?
The internet's built on that.
Yeah. And SOAP went astray, right? SOAP was on an evolutionary path that was getting better than XMLRPC. We did some incredibly stupid stuff in SOAP 1.1. Incredibly stupid. SOAP section 5, horrible, 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 required way too much buy-off on a bunch of new abstractions. Horrible, and we've killed it, right? SOAP section 5 is, WSI has basically deprecated it, and what remains of SOAP section 5 and SOAP 1.2 is so minimal it's hard to disagree with. We have these two attributes, ID and ref. And if you have something in there twice, you put an ID on it. And if you want to refer to it, you use the ref attribute to point to it. I know it's horrible. I know it's a big abstraction for a lot of people, but that's it. That is fundamentally all that's left of SOAP section 5 in SOAP 1.2. And that's goodness. And so the idea is, in this world, we want a much lower set of fixed abstractions and no user abstractions. That's the goal. And the Rastafarians, have been preaching this. The problem is they're preaching the philosophy and trying to sell you a set of abstractions at the same time, right? Which is the mistake, right? Fundamentally, there's a broader thing here, which is this move towards service orientation, sometimes called service-oriented architectures by people who want to charge more money for consulting. But fundamentally, service orientation is about designing by having a small fixed set of abstractions and no more. And that's what SOAP is headed towards. That's where certainly my group at Microsoft, who we have like 200 people responsible for making SOAP work for us and for you. And this is definitely the direction we're headed with SOAP. So let's talk a little bit about service orientation means. Services create very few new shared abstractions, right? There's a high tax, right? And the idea is we take the approach of clusters, right, where in distributed systems, right, and in parallel systems, we put a high cost on sharing, right? If I'm going to share a disk, that's going to be a reliability point, right? That's going to be a point of failure. If I'm going to share a database record, that's now going to be a point of contention. If I share an abstraction, it also has a cost. And the fundamental premise of service orientation is that we try to control sharing of abstractions the same way we try to control sharing of other resources in our computing system. Another aspect of service orientation, this applies to web services, it applies to all kinds of things, is that we take for granted a minimal, shared, and stable, I can't emphasize enough, stable kernel that doesn't change. That is, we're going to hold a bunch of things fixed, and we will all agree on those. But that's hopefully all we have to agree on to work together. And so for web services, as, as the industry has decided to define them, right? This is not mine. That's XML 1.0. It's HTTP, and with deference to Dave, it's SOAP, right? The industry has aligned behind SOAP. Despite the fact XML-RPC was workable, for whatever reason, they went with the big coast. I love Dave's stuff, but the world. The amount of money being spent to support SOAP, the amount of engineering dollars being. Maybe it does. It does, Dave. No, no question. It does cost more to support SOAP than XML-RPC. But you know, we live in an industry where we have a lot of mouths to feed, and if something is too simple, right? You know, how am I going to get paid? There's an aspect of job security to it. There's also, I mean, I don't want to get into a beauty contest between SOAP and XML-RPC. There are some distinct advantages. There are some distinct things we lost in the translation, and hopefully we'll get them back.
I don't think you're right.
Okay. Point taken, Dave. Let it be noted that on this date and time, Don Box and Dave Weiner disagreed for the first time ever. It'll be a national holiday, I know. Services assume high latency and low-fi connectivity, right? When I do service-oriented software development and service-oriented integration, I assume a very high latency, low fidelity communication channel between the developers. That's the important thing, right? It costs a lot to get people to agree, let alone to send the messages. You know, the message sending cost, screw that, right? That's just, you know, we throw hardware at it, or we set user expectations lower, God forbid, right? Or certainly, you know, physics is not on our side with respect to latency of packets, right? And we know how to optimize around that. The problem is we don't spend a lot of time figuring out how to optimize around the human costs, right? I worked on a bunch of those WS specs, right? Back in last year, you know, everybody was shipping a WS this, that, and the other thing. And we worked with various industry partners, right, IBM, to get those specs out the door. And I have to tell you, the cost of cross-organizational collaboration is incredibly high, way higher than I ever expected, right? I had no clue, and I'd worked on some W3C stuff, so I'd seen disagreement and all that stuff, but it turns out that it's very, very hard to have shared understanding of what you're actually designing. And if you look at the WS suite of specs, the simpler ones are better because we had to agree on less. Right? The ones where we have to agree on all kinds of esoteric interpretation, they're weaker specs. Right? The ones where we just had to say, this is an address, and it's the target, and it's going to go in a SOAP header. Okay, that's pretty good, caveman style. Right? It's kind of interesting when you if you ever become a writer, you learn that the sweet spot for writing English language prose is the 8th grade reading level. Right? Why? Because it's clearer for most people. They have to interpret less, right? Same thing goes for this stuff, right? The simpler the abstraction, the fewer the abstraction, the better, right? If it takes a lot of energy to understand what you're doing, if I have to understand the subtlety of the element substitution group you put in that XML schema in order to make your service work correctly, we're screwed. It ain't going to work. It just isn't going to work. The obvious one, services compose of coarse-grained message boundaries. What happens in this world is the extensibility model, and this is actually the one place where I feel comfortable saying that there's a distinct difference between SOAP and XML-RPC. XML-RPC is excellent if I have a point-to-point conversation. That is, if I'm sending the message to you and you're going to send me the response back. SOAP, the primary advantage of SOAP is if I don't have that. If I actually expect the message to be routed through intermediaries, right? That's really the only useful feature SOAP gives you. Without that, all you need is XML, right? But this notion of having a well-understood, simple processing model, which is still taking 5 years for people to implement correctly, just to prove my point, but having a very small number of abstractions in terms of header block and SOAP must understand, gives us a way to build extensibility at a much coarser grain level, right? And this turns out to be fairly powerful, and I think you'll see more of this over the next couple of years. And then finally, this one's really important. XML schema is not a type system. It purports to be one, and it does a very bad job at it. If you came to the last Web Services DevCon, the one in Boston, Noah Mendelsohn, who was one of the editors of XML Schema Part 1, and he's still a friend even though he did that, Noah had this great comment, which was, schemas are relative. Right? This was a earth-shattering thing for me, because I have tons of respect for Noah. Noah's an incredibly smart guy, way smarter than me. I just think the world of Noah. And when Noah got up there and said, we're going to share some XML data, and you're going to have a schema for it, you're going to have a schema for it, you're going to have a schema for it, and I'm going to have a schema for it, and they're all going to be different. That was like my head exploded. That was like one of these watershed moments in my life of just understanding what it is we do here. And the fact that XML schema isn't the authoritative description of the XML, rather it's just your way of making sure it works. That was like a major change, because that was not the design point. Right? Many people who worked on XML schema thought, I am actually augmenting XML. We joked on the schema working group, which I did 9 months on. You know, we're actually doing XML 2.0. Right? That was the common belief on the working group, that we were basically defining the next version of XML, and all of these post-schema validation info set contributions, also known as PSVI, that was going to become as real as anything, and that all of this interpretation that was added by the schema would become part of the actual data that we interchanged. That was a core belief of the schema working group. And Noah, who helped design a lot of that stuff, had come to the conclusion that that was not a good place to be. That basically schemas are relative, right? They are not the absolute truth. The absolute truth is what's on the wire. What I can measure, what I can observe, what I can test against, what I can write machine verification against. That's the absolute truth. XML schema is a relative interpretation of that truth, which might help you, but the kind of help you need may be different than the kind of help you need, or you need, or you need. And so XML schema is not a type system. And the notion that in my programming language, I'm going to walk up to an XML schema, either directly or indirectly through WSDL, and expect all of those XML schema constructs to come into my programming language is a bad path to be on. And we set ourselves up on that path several years ago, but I think saner heads, cooler heads are prevailing. Authoritative description of the XML, rather it's just your way of making sure it works. That was like a major change, because that was not the design point. Right? Many people who worked on XML schema thought, I am actually augmenting XML. We joked on the schema working group, which I did 9 months on. You know, we're actually doing XML 2.0. Right? That was the common belief on the working group, that we were basically defining the next version of XML, and all of these post-schema validation info set contributions, also known as PSVI, that was going to become as real as anything, and that all of this interpretation that was added by the schema would become part of the actual data that we interchanged. That was a core belief of the schema working group. And Noah, who helped design a lot of that stuff, had come to the conclusion that that was not a good place to be. That basically schemas are relative, right? They are not the absolute truth. The absolute truth is what's on the wire. What I can measure, what I can observe, what I can test against, what I can write machine verification against. That's the absolute truth. XML schema is a relative interpretation of that truth, which might help you, but the kind of help you need may be different than the kind of help you need, or you need, or you need. And so XML schema is not a type system. And the notion that in my programming language, I'm going to walk up to an XML schema, either directly or indirectly through WSDL, and expect all of those XML schema constructs to come into my programming language is a bad path to be on. And we set ourselves up on that path several years ago, but I think saner heads, cooler heads are prevailing and are basically coming to the realization that, yeah, XML schema, it's what we got. It's not great, but trying to do another one at this point, good luck, right? But the fact that that's going to change the way you interpret the data, that that's going to bubble up into your programming model, that's probably not a good place to be, right? And so when we do service-oriented integration, the goal is not to share types, because types are abstractions. Rather, the goal is to share machine-readable validation instructions that tell us what is legal and what is illegal as input and output to the service, right? And the whole idea is, if I can't measure it, it never happened. And so relying on things like default values or, schema element substitution group heads and affiliation, which is something that if you get into XML schema, you get really addicted to. It's just crap. It doesn't go anywhere. It's bad. So my last slide. Here's the difference between the two worlds. In the object-oriented world, which we all know and love, and many of us get paid to work in, right, we have a fairly managed, or we can, if we choose to, have a managed development and test cycle. Right? A lot of us like to do it cowboy style, and that's okay. Right? But you don't have to, right? Because it's basically you and the people you pay or get paid by working together. We have abstraction-driven integrated development environments. Right? We have this thing called IntelliSense, right, that is driven by abstraction. The more abstractions you build, the more accurate and ornate the abstractions you build, the better the IDE works with your library. Right? Developers expect all that stuff. Right? If you just gave them one big interface with 600 methods, like the original Word automation interface, people would run screaming because IntelliCrack would just explode. Right? They need the hierarchy of objects to be able to guide them through the development experience against your code. That's the way object orientation works. It's platform constrained. You know the target platforms you're developing for. You can integrate those into your test plans. And finally, there's a lot of compiler technology that has been focused in this area. So lots of optimizations have taken place. Lots of understanding about 30 years plus of building compilers has benefited this world. And of course, in object orientation, I'm just building an app, and many people think if I mark the field as private, that's all the security I ever need, right? And for some apps, that might actually be okay, right? For apps that don't do any file I/O, actually for an app that doesn't do any I/O whatsoever, that's actually conceivable as a reasonable security strategy. Let's compare this to service orientation. Unknown integration partner, right? I don't know who to test against because that person doesn't exist yet, right? So I better bound the number of interactions between my code and their code because I don't know their code. I have no way of knowing anything about their code. The best thing I can do is write very good constraints on what the input and output to my system is so I can get some machine-oriented validation so I don't have to worry too much about unbounded variation. Primitive tooling. I got news for you. The tooling for web services sucks. Right? Nowhere near as sophisticated as the tooling for object-oriented programming. Right? We're fortunate that there's an entire industry of unemployed programmers or afraid to be unemployed programmers who are willing to dedicate their next 5 years of their life to making this tooling experience much better. Right? But we're not there yet. Right? Visual Studio's okay, it's not great. Right? WebSphere is okay, not great. Emacs, of course, is perfect, but how many people really use Emacs? Unknown platform, right? I have no idea. I can make no assumptions about where the integration partner is actually going to be running. Thank God we're done with these WS specs, right? The number of new WS specs is on the decrease. There's only one more left, which is WS privacy from IBM, which is IBM, BEA, and Microsoft. That's what the acronym actually stands for. There's only one other spec we actually care about getting out, which is WS privacy. Everything else is just clean up on the stuff we've already shipped. We have to clean up that mess and go implement it. But you're not going to see lots of new WS specs coming out, so that's good. But we've certainly had a hell of a lot of them, and they're certainly not implemented. Right? You can't just go to .NET and have all that stuff implemented. It's just not there yet, right? And of course, there's intense security requirements, right? By definition, services are accessible to lots of people. And some of those people aren't as nice as Dave and I, right? You know, we have nothing but your best interests at heart, right? But there are some people out there who aren't so altruistic. So given all this, services, it's a tough time. Right? A lot of work to do. But, you know, it's an interesting set of challenges, which I'm pretty confident we'll rise to. I have a bunch of slides I'm going to skip past and cut right to the end, which is where are we? SOAP, service orientation, service-oriented programming, shifts the model, shifts the focus from types and abstractions to schemas and contracts. And I use the term schema loosely, right? Machine verifiable contracts that describe the inputs and outputs to the system, no more, no less. Those are not types. They may help you build types, but those are not types that we're sharing. Objects are to services what ICs are to devices, right? The whole goal is that we do integration at a very coarse-grained level and that we don't try and get inside and change it. If we don't like it, we get rid of it. And if the boundaries are coarse-grained enough, we have an opportunity to actually do field replacement. You know, lots of energy behind this stuff. It's getting better every year, getting better every month. And simplicity and minimalism rule the day, right? You can't, you know, I'm not a literate person, but there was someone who's dead now who said, I would have written you, I'm sorry I wrote you a long, is it Lincoln? I thought it was Lincoln, but I didn't want to make an ass of myself. So I just thought I'd go for the, I'm stupid right off the bat. Right. So it was Lincoln who said, I didn't have time to write you a short note, so I wrote you this long note. Right. It takes time to get a simple design, right? It's easy to build a complex interface, right? Because you just take all the things you're thinking, random ass shit, put it in there and say, have fun, right? It takes forever to whittle it down to something that is as close to nothing as possible. And that's actually a great litmus test, you know, in this space, is if you can get it as close to, if the amount of abstraction I have to sell you is nil, then that's a really good place to be. So anyway, that's the talk.
Thank you very much, Tom.
Thanks.